Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on navigating Singapore's novel regulatory framework in 2023. So my name is Serene, and I'm the Communications and Operations Manager here at the Future Ready Food Safety Hub, or FRESH for shorts. And I will be your host and moderator for today. So if you aren't already familiar with FRESH, we are a partnership between Agency for Science, Technology and Research, or A*STAR, Singapore Food Agency, SFA, and Nanyang Technological University, NTU, to build Singapore's capabilities in food safety science to support the entry of novel foods. So before we get started, just I'll mention some housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box or Zoom chat at any time, and we will address them during the Q&A session as we approach the end of this webinar. So if we are unable to address all the questions, please feel free to direct your query to our email at fresh@ntu.edu.sg, and we will respond to you to the best of our abilities. So this webinar will be recorded and sent to all registered participants shortly after the session. So without further ado, let's start with the speaker introductions. So maybe let's start with Dr. Tan Yong Chuan from the Singapore Food Agency. Maybe you can start tell us what you do at SFA.
Right. Yes. Hi, Serene. Yeah, thanks, Serene, for the opening session. So I am Yong Chuan. I am a scientist at the Risk Assessment and Communication Department under the National Centre for Food Science in the Singapore Food Agency. So a main part of my work is to conduct safety assessment of novel foods. And also for myself, I also do conduct safety assessment of genetically modified organisms for food. Frankly, I'm quite new to this organization. I joined in November 2021. So, but I think in this past year, I have learned a lot from academia and from especially from companies. And this is a very, very exciting field. I'm sure all of us will agree on that. So yes, thank you. Yeah. So back to you, Serene.
Yeah, so maybe next can we have Jolene from Nurasa?
Yeah, thanks for holding the time and for organizing this. My name is Jolene. I work for Nurasa. Nurasa is a year-old company by Temasek, so we're a wholly owned subsidiary. Our mandate is to commercialize accelerate the commercialization and adoption of different sustainable food categories in Asia Pacific. We're building up a food tech innovation center, which is going to be a first food-grade facility for different companies who might also be interested in holding novel food tasting. We're also tracking very closely with SFA different companies working on novel food products around the world who have an interest in Asia and Singapore. So yeah, thanks for having me here and excited for the conversation.
Yeah, so last but not least, we have Dr. Benjamin Smith from FRESH.
Yeah, thanks, Serene. And it's always good because you've already given the introduction of who FRESH is and what we do. So it makes it easy. But I think one of the points that Dr. Tan raised about him being new in this space, we're all new, right? Learning about these novel technologies. And so it's great to be here with everyone and have the opportunity to talk a little bit about where things are going with regard to novel food safety and regulatory frameworks and how FRESH can help. So one of the things that you introduced is that we're a tripartite organization working with these different agencies and at NTU, but also we're tripartite in that we do try and pull together industry and academics and regulators together as well. And so that's something that we're keen to see how we can help the ecosystem evolve and assist any interested companies looking to bring products to Singapore and the region with understanding what may or may not need to be done with regard to generating safety data specifically for Singapore, but in general for novel foods.
Yeah, fantastic. Let me turn this screen off so that we can see each other a lot more clearly. Okay, so maybe we can begin by looking at a quick introduction of Singapore's novel food regulatory framework and its evolution, because I think we do have a few people from who are not from Singapore, so maybe we might want to give them kind of like a top line information of what we've been doing so far.
Right. So maybe I can start. Right. So right. So this is so Singapore has these safety guide has installed the safety framework for novel foods since November 2019, and since then we have been updating. So this has taken the form of a guidance document and also novel food clinics with interested companies, both at early stage and also at ready to submit stages, so as to guide them through the safety assessment for novel foods. So the reason why we need a safety assessment for novel foods, this is not unique to Singapore, and many countries are also implementing regulatory frameworks for novel foods in one form or another. This is because novel foods, or as other countries might call it, new food sources and production systems, they are new to humans, they are new to the general population in their specific country or region. And because these are new, either they are new sources or new production systems, they can pose new food safety risks, right? So and because of that, and because they do not have a history of safe use, there is a need. So food safety agencies see them, not just Singapore, but also in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, in Japan, in Canada, all see the need to conduct pre-market safety assessment of such foods, so that based on the best of current standing of our scientific knowledge and the best of our analytical platforms, we are able to capture the risks that are presented by such food and to ensure that they are safe. So in Singapore specifically, not specifically, but in Singapore, I think we come from a standpoint that food safety is a shared responsibility between both regulators and also the industry. And because these foods are new, we take part, we encourage industry to be transparent with us. We don't prescribe. We see it as we don't prescribe standards or guidelines or regulations. Rather, because this is new to everyone, right? So there's a lot of knowledge gaps. We approach it as a consultative process, whereby as we learn from companies, companies also learn from us. So we co-develop guidelines and regulations. So we take guidance from what is implementable in the industry, what is practical, and we also take guidance from what are the known risks based on the best knowledge in scientific literature, and from there we develop guidance for the industry. So I think that the main form of our the main mode by which our regulatory framework manifests is through our guidance documents on SFA's website. So ever since its first publication in November 2019, it has undergone 5 revisions, which I would say is a lot for a government document. So, but again, we see it as a living document which we update based on our current based on our best knowledge of what is out there in science, and also what is feasible, what is implementable, what can facilitate the development of this novel food ecosystem. Yeah, while ensuring safety.
Yeah, I think the best thing about our regulatory system is like I think there are a lot of different parties working in an ecosystem. So we have people from the we working with people like Fresh, SFA, A-Star, and also like startups, Murasa, and other groups as well, to kind of like always come together and ideate. That's why we want to, so that we can push this a lot further.
Serene, can I jump in and make a comment? Because I think that it's interesting also on this point of evolution. And when you look at how a lot of the sort of food safety regulations have moved forward, they've sort of come across, not just talking Singapore here, but across different zones. They've developed out afterwards and following the legislative process. And it's interesting when you look at typically sort of the innovation curve versus the regulatory curve, and the pacing of the innovation is in most cases a lot quicker than the pacing of the regulatory frameworks. But what's really interesting, I think, in this space of alternative proteins and particularly cellular meat, where Singapore is doing a lot, but more generally in this area of novel foods, is that because we're having a lot of discussion about the innovation, we've got, particularly here in Singapore, this, I'll say, use the term flexibility of the framework, where it allows interaction, it allows this case-by-case approach to look at and learn from new products coming forward. What it's actually doing is allowing us to pull these curves closer together. And actually, innovation's always still going to be a little bit ahead, and particularly in this space, but it's allowing us to start getting more into parallel and understanding these things. And that's important because when we look at the development from an industry perspective in this space as well, it's not like the classical food additive space where someone says, oh, I might make a new emulsifier and they're following certain rules, or I'm a new enzyme that I'm bringing to the market. In this space, the innovation is changing, and it's probably like this at the moment, the way that it's going. It's really steep, and even some of these companies that started out back in 2019 when SFA did the first approval of with Just Chicken at the time, and from there have grown, and some of the other fungal proteins and things that have come through in that time as well. Even some of these companies that started with those first products have changed their products significantly, and new products over that time. And so it's really important that we do have that working together and that flexibility to bring those two curves closer together.
Yeah, this is really interesting, Ben. Okay, so maybe speaking of this, ecosystem, how are we working, like there are like different, how is SFA working with partners in the novel food ecosystem?
Right. So for novel foods, so we always go back to our first principles. It's always ensuring safety. So so we do realize, so of course we partner with academia and also industry. So, and why we do so is because there are safety issues which are implementable, which are known knowns, like things like microbiological hazards, heavy metal hazards. These are what are known hazards. So in this area, we partner with we consult industry and try to find out what is implementable, what is practical, what are the new critical control points which we need to look at. And on the other hand, there are also hazards which are less well characterized, so like unknown hazards. And in this regard, of course, industry, we do encourage industry to also look at these, and because there's a lot of data gaps. So these hazards could be what might be the food safety risk of perhaps like ingesting certain new chemicals or new biological substances in cultivated meat, for example, right? So and also we also partner with academia. So in this regard, of course, Fresh and also our research institutes come in very handy, and also very valuable for us and filling in these data gaps, because again these data gaps, they are new to food, but they are not necessarily new to science in general. Of course, like certain cellular phenomena have been studied in molecular biology, in drug production, for example. So in this regard, we really have been we are actively working with our research institutes to fill in these data gaps. because and after filling in these data gaps, and the aim of filling in these data gaps is to form a basis for a more rigorous safety assessment, right? And of course, we realize, and I think this is a trend that and companies are moving, is that they are forming associations, right? To collectively work together to fill in these data gaps, because I think a lot of these companies, they are startups, and even if they are not startups, it can be quite difficult and time consuming for a single company to fill in these data gaps by themselves. But so I think a very strategic move that some of them have taken is to form is to really work together, promote the exchange of information with each other, and really work towards developing, filling in data gaps, and also developing new methods for that ensure the rigor of safety assessment. So perhaps in this regard, Jolene or Ben would like to comment? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe Jolene, you can tell us more about how Nurasa is working with SFA for your startups.
For sure. So I think with Nurasa, the focus is the commercialization of these products, which I think is also on the mind of a lot of the companies and startups working to bring these new products to market. So I think where Nurasa comes in is that we're always scanning the market and talking to companies who are interested in bringing these technologies to Singapore. Needless to say, there's been a lot of interest because we were the first country to approve cultivated meat for sale. So there continues to be a lot of interest for companies to coming to Singapore, setting up an office here, or even starting to do some production here as well. So for that, what Nurasa has been looking at is also providing the pilot scale infrastructure for companies to come here, set up some pilot scale space to actually use the space to also test it out, use it as a playground. And also, as Yongquan said, it's a living and evolving document as to what the guidelines look like. And in the same vein, Nurasa's Food Tech Innovation Center, which we are building up for the start of next year, is a space where we're looking at actively hosting novel food companies for potential tastings, but also to set up pilot scale facilities that SFA and us are mutually learning from, pitfalls, watch-outs, opportunities, how to optimize the process to ensure safety, as well as to educate consumers. It's a space for tasting, it's a space for potentially engaging the public, educating them a little bit more about what they're eating, and also, of course, in the new category of hybrid products. Within the Food Tech Innovation Center, there's the capability for novel food ingredients to be formulated into different kinds of final products. And I think that's also where you get different opportunities to help companies understand what are the different steps and processes involved in creating the final product. So I think in that way, we've worked very closely with SFA to also say, hey, we've created a food grade facility, one of the first food grade facilities at innovation pilot scale in the world, so as to be able to actually grow alongside these companies, and then from there see how we can assist them to scale across Asia as well. Yeah, maybe Ben, over to you.
Yeah, well, I think it's always good when you can follow up, and I think some of the key points that I'll pull out from Yongquan and Jolene, from what both of you have said, is really this aspect of engagement and discussion on all of these points. So as you've heard, different people have been speaking about how we've got these opportunities to look at facilities that can help support development, but those facilities don't sit by themselves. They have groups like the Future Ready Food Safety Hub next door that can come in and say, well, okay, if you're doing this, what implication could it have from a safety perspective? You've got SFA involved. And I really think that in this space, it's challenging, right? Because companies are developing and they're coming up with their own products. There's a certain level of proprietary and confidential information that needs to be shared, that needs to be maintained within the company. But equally, it's also an area where we're all learning together and trying to move products forward, because there's a higher interest here too as to why we are investing in this space, why we need to be looking at new approaches to food security. And so I think because of that effort, we're actually seeing a lot more open discussion going on, as was mentioned. I'm not sure if it was Yongchen or Jolene, but as mentioned, with the companies coming together in forming these industry associations like the APAC Cellular Meat and the Europe and the US ones, and they're even coming together. And I think that effort of dialogue, putting the facts on the table, is one of the reasons why things have started moving together. But this level of discussion, we need to keep going at different levels. It's not just at the level of the companies or a particular company with SFA or coming to a fresh. It's also at the level of SFA with the Food Standards Australia, New Zealand, SFA with European Food Safety Authority or US FDA. And we're seeing even more sharing across the globe from a regulatory and safety perspective. And I think that's really key. When you see organizations like this coming together to try and understand, and it will actually help move things forward a lot more quickly. It's like the whole proverb, right, of the moss gathering stone. So here in Singapore, we've started out rolling that stone, but look how it's rolling across the globe. And you can even see that with organizations like FAO coming and getting involved, which typically, as an organization, it's not responsible for authorization. It's not responsible for bringing these sorts of products to market, but they're now helping get the discussion going, because it links into the whole concept of food security, of which food safety is a key component. So I think that that's one of the things that is really one of the big eye-openers in this space from a regulatory perspective, at least from an old person like myself who has been working in this sort of space for a while and seeing how different regulations and frameworks move. Here we really do have this opportunity to see how, not just by building a regulatory framework and ensuring things are safe, and as Yongchen said, a lot of these safety approaches and thinking, it's not rocket science, right? Cellular biology, so it's probably harder than rocket science in some cases, let's be honest. But it's understanding what how these products, what really they are. They're cellular, they're new proteins, right? We know what proteins are. We eat a lot of proteins. So looking at them logically and then saying, where are the gaps, as was mentioned, where are there areas that we need to do more work, and then coming together to ensure that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ben. There has been definitely a lot of conversations and dialogue, even in the recent COP27. Like typically they talk a lot about energy and and stuff like that, but this time they talk a lot about food security, and we even had like a food tasting by Good Meats, so at the Singapore Pavilion. Yeah, I think that was kind of a great advancement in future foods. Okay, so speaking of that, so most recently, FDA provided a safety nod for the first time to Upside Foods cultivated chicken meat. So what do you think are the key learnings for Singapore's regulatory process? Yeah, I think a lot of people are quite curious about this actually. So this will be quite interesting.
I think it's a question I think we I have to see it coming. So yes, we are studying it. And so I think before, so perhaps just to add on to what Ben said earlier about regulators, about SFA engaging with stakeholders on multiple levels. So we have been engaging with like-minded regulators from the US, both USDA and also the USDA Department of Agriculture, and also the FDA. Prior to the approval, so I think the words they would use were no objection. So this, prior to this no objection statement by the US FDA. So just to give it a bit of context, so because it's a cultivated meat product, so Upside will have to seek FDA's no objections statement first, which I think according to Uma Valeti, they have been working on it for 6-7 years. And afterwards, they will proceed to seek a so-called a grant of inspection from USDA for with regard to label, because it's a meat product, so to work on production issues, labeling issues, right? All these. So we have been back to the engagement. So we have been engaging with US regulators. I think at a purely scientific level, we find that perhaps not a surprise, but it's always a very pleasant to know that independently, our safety considerations, our physical, biological, and chemical considerations for safety are aligned, right? They converge at the same point from a scientific safety assessment perspective, right? And of course, ever since FDA gave the no objection statement to the outside product, we have been studying it quite closely, and we are identifying certain areas where perhaps we could SFA could be more facilitative without compromising safety. So I think right now, like as I heard too many times, that our number one priority is always to ensure product safety, but we are always trying to look at areas. Are there certain areas? Are there data gaps? Are there certain areas that we could work on to facilitate innovation and to really close the as Ben said earlier, close the gap between innovation and regulation. So this is what we are working on very closely. And also, I think we need to be very aware here. So while on a purely scientific basis, I think the regulators are from US and also Singapore, and I would say from like-minded regulators from UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. We are quite similar in our thinking, but we have to be aware of the political and historical context of the FDA with regard to food safety, with regard to food in the US. So it is not so, because the context of FDA in the US and SFA in Singapore, they are not exactly the same. So we need to be aware where that SFA is not able to just copy FDA's no objection statement, right? So our starting point, as always, is always to ensure food safety, and if wherever possible, based on the best knowledge of scientific data and analytical techniques, our analytical technology, as we try to see if there's any way we can facilitate innovation, right?
Yeah, so speaking of technology, I think the industry has been speaking quite a lot about new approach methodologies or NEMs for regulatory decision making. So why do you think this is so? Like, why is this like trending? And how does this support the regulatory approval for novel foods?
Do you want me to jump in there, Serene?
Sure.
Can I also just make a comment on that previous point? I think that in the learning from the FDA, just to quickly summarize a bit, I think what we're finding as we have these different discussions is that from a science perspective, yes, there are areas that we need to learn, but a lot of what we're doing is the same. And there's a lot of similarity. And as Yong Chen was saying, really some of the challenges aren't so much on understanding the safety and the science, they're on the regulatory differences and how do we fit that in. And that's where some of these different countries have slightly different approaches. But for the companies and things that are out there that looking at bringing their products to market, at least in the past, it used to be, so you'd say, where would I start with my dossier for my new ingredient? Do I go the US route or do I go the EU route? Now we've got, because of this approach here in Asia and particularly in Singapore, we've got this opportunity to go also the Singapore route where from a legislative perspective, and some of what's required is a little bit different, but in principle, what you build here and in getting onto market here because of the way things are going will only help you when you go to the US and eventually to Europe, where you may need a little bit more because of their structure. And that's also, I think, where we're seeing some of the discussion, to go to your point, on things like NAMs, so new approach methods, where we're starting to also see a shift in how do we actually do the right science for safety testing. So what we've noticed with safety testing across the board, not just for food, is that there is a social pressure that's rising on how do we actually test things safely. And in the alternative protein space, we actually see a lot of this pressure coming in because many of these new ingredients, these plant-based or microbial-based proteins or cellular-based proteins, have been brought in because of the interest around the social pressures to develop new sustainable foods, to develop things that are new food technologies that move us away from raising animals in farms and some of the welfare issues that are there. So there are a lot of social pressures that are moving in to understand on the safety testing, that are moving into this NAMS area, so non-animal testing and in vitro approaches. But what we're also finding now, and a number of people who work in this space, but one of the leaders, Professor Thomas Hartung, he always makes the comment that humans aren't 70-kilogram mice. And if you look at how the safety testing of ingredients has been done in the past, a lot of it's been done on very classical toxicology, looking at how do we actually understand a rodent ingesting these materials, could it actually then help us understand what could be the effect on humans? And what we're starting to understand is that many of these animal models that classically we've used as toxicology aren't actually appropriate for assessing the types of materials and ingredients that we're looking at now. They may not help us look at the human relevance. And so we've seen a shift in what we call the toxicological paradigm, where we're trying to develop more tests that help us understand the mechanisms involved with various toxicities, whether it's you're applying skin or testing. So designing better tests to help us deal with new chemicals. And then the other sort of pressure, and what's interesting in this, in the food space particularly, is the growth of new ingredients and technologies coming onto the market. How can we actually develop better safety systems and tests and methods that are meeting this rate of increase of new ingredients, new chemicals coming onto the market? And when we think about foods, a lot of the time when you're thinking about your food, you're thinking about the final burger that you're going to be eating. But if you're someone like myself who's a food toxicologist and food safety scientist, what we do is we break food down into essentially the chemicals, the components, and we say, how do we assess all of these components in the food? And if you think of something like cellular meat, well, you've got two main components. You've got the cell line and you've got the media. And the media is a collection of chemicals, and the cell line is a little factory that is making chemicals, pretty much, of which eventually we're going to eat. So if we can break those down and understand how they work, understand their safety, great. But a lot of these compounds, how do we test them quickly? How do we do them the right way and relevant? And that's really where new approach methods come to the forefront, because we can actually apply more robust, quicker and human relevant testing methods to help understand the safety of ingredients that we're using in consumer products and foods.
Yeah, do you think these will be able to, we've been talking a little bit about data gaps earlier. So do you think NAMs will kind of like be able to contribute to addressing these data gaps?
Yeah, definitely. It's one way. And also, I think one of the things that we have to understand about NAMs, a little bit like understanding the new novel proteins, is that it's an area that is growing and evolving as well. We're understanding more and more. We're developing different types of cell systems. We've gone from in the toxicity testing and in vitro space, we've gone from single cell systems now to complex 3D epithelial models. So it's a space that is evolving, that can we can learn from and understand. And so, yes, definitely these tools will help us fill gaps. They'll definitely help us understand more mechanistically about what's happening. But it will always be an evolution. And but what we have to see as we move, whether it's changing from a new food source into different areas or changing from a new safety testing approach, we have to look at where we're actually gaining the leverage and the benefit. And by moving into new approach methods, we can actually gain a lot more understanding about some of these small molecules and their effects, and build up that understanding, so that when we use similar materials, we're not having to always test. Whereas when you're testing it, if you think about testing in an animal system, what you're actually looking at is pretty much black box. You're looking for an end effect or an end point, similar to like a doctor who's diagnosing you for a disease. So you go into the doctor and you've got a runny nose, right? So, oh, it's a virus. Okay, yeah, maybe it's a virus, maybe it's bacterial. Most of the time you don't know, right? But you take an action and you take a decision. Where the NAMs are very good, and where the diagnostic test, say for a doctor, so a COVID test or something like that, that's telling you, yes, it really is a virus, it's COVID. And that's sort of what we're also trying to do with things like NAMs. Is this system actually having effect? Can I use it to find out something more, to understand whether there's going to be a likelihood of safety? So yeah, definitely filling gaps, but also understanding more about the types of materials that we're using, and particularly in this space where we're seeing maybe some materials that classically haven't been in the food space before. And obviously that always raises questions for regulators, because a big part of the safety assessment and things that make it novel is not consumed over a period of time by a significant portion of the population. And many of these things that we've used classically in cell biology from an R&D or even medical perspective, they've never seen the light of food. So we have to understand about what may happen from an ingestion and oral perspective.
I just wanted to add in there as well. It's really interesting because the Food Tech Innovation Center that we're building has also drawn a lot of interest from companies developing intermediate sort of microcarriers, different things that are part of that process. And because it is a food grade facility, the first conversation we often end up having is, could you comply to SFA's sort of food safety management system? And I think that's already a very good litmus test of how that needs to continue to evolve. Do we hold up these companies who are enablers in that value chain to the same food safety, quality, and standards? And also how will that happen at the scale up level, right? So at the pilot scale, you have one set of regulations and consistency, but also how do we ensure that going forward as we scale up is the other, I think, challenge that will come in the next few years.
Right. So sorry, just to sum up, so Ben's and Jolie's comments. So I think with new foods, so we do understand that animal tests, they are still, I think some people won't like it, but they're still the gold standard. But again, because for new foods, and to go back to my point on SFA not being prescriptive, so with new foods and sources and production systems, I think ultimately what we're looking for is a strong scientific argument that it is safe, so we cannot be too prescriptive. But again, if you want to, if companies want to do 90-day subchronic, we are not going to reject it. We're not going to say it's wrong. It might be wrong from an animal ethics point of view, but from a food safety, it is still a gold standard. But again, we do welcome companies to come to us and also discuss with us, and also to develop norms, new approach methodologies, because ultimately we understand we cannot be too prescriptive. We must be open to what is the best science, what is the most recent advancements in science that make a strong argument that the food is optimally safe for human consumption. Thanks.
Yeah, I think in the long-term point of view, right, it's like because we always keep talking about sustainability, so we are not, just addressing sustainability in the food security sense, but also, helping with, the animal ethics part as well. So I mean, it's probably a long term view of how we can actually get closer to being actually sustainable. But I think it's a good food for thought, literally, to think about how we can proceed in this space. Okay, so just now we were talking about the SFA. We cannot be too prescriptive. But do you think that developing industry-wide standards and checkbox templates be beneficial for approval?
Right, so I think for the benefit of everyone, I think ideally, I would say for both regulators and industry, people want simple checkboxes. We definitely understand why, but the thing with checkboxes is they might not make sense for all cases. So there might be basic checkboxes. So for example, checkboxes for heavy metals and listeria or 0157. So these are non-negotiable, for example, and it's very, very established that these need to be tested for, right? But because it's an evolving industry, and actually I would say it's a nascent in the ecosystem. While we look forward, while we can, both regulators, academia, and industry can work together to develop international standards for novel foods. But I would say right now, we do not want to be too prescriptive. It might stifle innovation, right? It might block certain pathways which we might find later on, oh, we shouldn't have set standards so early on. So so we don't want that. But of course we are always happy to work with industry, with academia, with like-minded regulators from overseas, with the FAO to develop guidelines that move towards international standards for novel foods. Again, standards, of course, would be, I think everyone will agree is helpful. This is something that we can look forward to, and it will be helpful because it does it promotes international trade, and also it increases consumer confidence.
Thank you so much.
Karine, I think you also have to be careful as what are you determining as standards, right? There's so many different types of standards that are in there. So definitely you need to standardize some of the approaches that are used to collect data and show that you've got standard methods so that when a regulator can compare and say, oh, okay, yes, this is what you did. But do you need to have a prescriptive standard of this is the specification of what is a cellular meat, or this is the process that has to be made? Obviously there we can't, because there's a lot of evolution in the system. So I think there too, we need some understanding of how standards are used, what their use is, and not just talk broadly about should we have standards in this space. Definitely certain standards you need, others we need to wait. And then also with some of these tools like the guidance documents, they're there to help a company say, okay, what do I need to start thinking about? Again, as Yongchen said, they're not prescriptive. You can go in, and as long as you can justify and weight of evidence on the table, the safety of your product, and as long as you've shown that you've thought about the particular issues and addressed them, you can put what data you feel relevant forward. But a lot of the time, people don't know what to ask. Many of the people coming into this space, as we're seeing through Fresh, they're the people on the innovation. They're trying to bring this new product in. They're trying to get the new idea out. So they don't necessarily have an understanding of where to start in this space. And that's where some of the guidelines that are being put out, whether it's by SFA or USDA or others, are helpful because they give you a start. But it's also where we have to have the sessions like this. It's where we have to have organizations like Fresh and others available to help companies say, well, okay, if I need this sort of data, how could I do it? And it's that sort of iterative process of not just putting out a book and telling everyone, read this, you'll know what to do. It's giving people touch points so that they can actually develop their products, and doing it also in this concept of safety by design, safety along the process. So one of the things that is really great that we're seeing in the alternative protein novel food space is that this discussion of safety is coming in very early as the products are being developed. And so that's going to change and develop, but it allows the safety people to also learn more and say, hang on, have you thought about this? Whereas in the past, a lot of the food products have gone to the end. Then you go to the safety scientists and they say, throw it away, or do this, this, and this, or yes, you'll be fine. And it's not the way to do it. And so that evolution as well, I think, is very important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. Okay, so I think lastly, before we proceed to the Q&A, I have one last question. So what kind of resources are available for companies that want to get their novel food products approved? Maybe Jolene can start.
Sure, I think Yongxuan will also be a good person to follow up in terms of what you're expecting. I think it's already quite transparent by SFA. But I think where Nurasa comes in as well is because we talk to all the companies who are interested in seeking approval in Singapore, there might be also interest in setting up your pilot scale facility or even tech transfer office here. I think it's a real consultative approach with SFA as well to say that, hey, we have a facility that you're familiar with. It's going to be ready soon. And when companies do come in, you sort of know what their process looks like, not to infringe on any IP or any kind of proprietary processes, but to ensure that there are familiar faces in that ecosystem and understand that if we do host something like a novel food tasting to actually drive a little bit of traction, to drive engagement, either with customers and potential industry players who might be selling that food product. I think it's an educational process, but also a way for us to understand a little bit more on how we position that product, how we actually bring it to market, as well as also for SFA to take a look at the way in which it's being produced in a full end-to-end facility, potentially from all the way the cell lines to the final product as well. So that's one of the things available. But yes, still looking forward to the first set of companies who will be coming in. So looking forward to work more closely with Yongchuan and team.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say if I have my own company and I want to arrange a food tasting session, what do I need to do to host this food tasting session?
Yeah, so for novel foods that have not been approved, you can choose to host the event here and at the FTIC, the Nurasa's Food Tech Innovation Center, but the company will still need to apply for a novel food tasting permit or approval with SFA.
Administrative exemption.
Yeah, administrative. Yes, exactly. So I think that's the exemption still needs to be applied by the company. But I think this process at the Nurasa level is something where we also confer with SFA to say that, hey, like we've spoken to this company as well. We trust what they're doing. We think they're ready to host the tasting. And on our end, we'll support to make sure that everything is in order and in place so that you also have an additional party to help safeguard at least that process.
Right, so just make a quick comment. So the point of the role of SFA in tasting sessions of unapproved novel foods is really not the police. We really don't want the police. I think that again we come from a point where I think everyone agrees that in this nascent ecosystem, any adverse incident would have strong repercussions throughout the whole ecosystem. It would that kill it and kill the whole ecosystem, not kill, damage the whole ecosystem in its infancy. So this is something that collectively we do not want to see. So so in this regard, so SFA is providing another layer of assurance, really to tasters, to working with companies to ensure that the foods, the unapproved novel foods, they are safe for one-time consumption. And again, we come from this principle that, and again, of course, we realize that companies perhaps they might see this administrative exemption process as being too troublesome, might be too restrictive. Again, it's a learning process. So we invite companies to talk to us, discuss with us on how we can collect. Also, we very much welcome working with Mirasa on how we can collectively streamline this processes. Because I think ultimately, I think we understand that we want to avoid any adverse events, and from SFA standpoint, I think, and to ensure that we want to make sure that tasting is done in a controlled environment, and that the tasting event is not open to members of public. And if there are certain and also that companies have in place certain measures to ensure the safety of participants in the event or adverse effects. So things like having EpiPens around, for example, would be very, very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. I think this is a challenging one, and maybe not the area to talk about here today in this webinar, because there's also aspects, of course, that are the legal aspects of whether it falls into the Saleable Food Act and other things. So it is a challenge to see how to do it. But I think the key point is, with all of these sorts of products and in this new space, is making sure that we're doing things the right way and openly making sure that information is shared when necessary, and that whoever's putting anything out is doing it in a responsible way, because the last thing that anyone wants to do is cause a black mark on an industry which is growing, because one company's black mark is going to tar the whole industry. And so I think that's really where people want to make sure that things are done safely.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's proceed to the Q&A session. Thank you so much for all the questions. So maybe we can start with Christian Kalk. So Christian asked, could you elaborate a bit on the risk evaluation of biological used in cell culture and differentiation? Maybe an example is available, like insulin.
Right, so I think I can take this question. So in our in SFA's updated guidance document dated 26 September, we have a flow chart on the use of biological substances such as insulin in cell culture media. So I think after today we can send you a link to our updated guidance document. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I think in the email later with a webinar recording, we can like also add in the link so that everyone can have a take a look at our current latest guidelines. Okay, so there's a question by Hui Hong Lee. Is there guidelines around the cell line safety, for example, genetic modified organisms?
All right, GMO. So yes, we do realize that for cell-based meat, especially people are using genetic engineering to generate organisms that can replicate far beyond the limit of senescence. So in this regard, we are working with our Genetic Modification Advisory Committee, GMAC, to look at the assessment together. And why we do so is because with GMOs, it is not just a food safety consideration, there are also ecological, environmental considerations. So in this regard, we would need to seek advice from GMAC. And this process is actually done for your typical GM crops like GM corn, GM soybean, for example. Right. So the guidelines can be found on GMAC's website, GMAC. So it would be the guidelines on agricultural release on release of organisms for agricultural purposes. But again, we do understand that there are various modalities in genetic engineering nowadays. So many. There are, of course, there's your traditional foreign gene insertion. There are also people are also using CRISPR to make small deletions, which does not introduce foreign DNA. So in this regard, I would encourage, because there are so many modalities, I would encourage companies to speak to us. And again, we need to co-develop a pathway for such products in Singapore, right? So I think so one issue one thing that we have realized through interaction with companies is that not just for genetic engineering, as companies I think want a straightforward answer. They want a checkbox, but the reality of the situation is we are SFA, and as well as many other regulators, we are learning. Right, so I think useful analogy to use in Singapore would be these companies are the pioneer generation, right? So it's always more difficult. It's always more difficult when you're a pioneer generation. You have to sow the seeds, but you can reap the fruits of the labor in the future. So we do encourage companies to work with us on this.
Here, I think too that sometimes you've got to be a bit careful too on having generalized questions. I think a little bit in some of these space as well, because you've got to look at it a little bit logically when it comes to the GM aspects. Where are the risks, and what questions am I looking to address? And so the GMAC at the moment is very much positioned to look at plants, genetics, and microbial, and what happens if they could get released out into the environment. But then where I suppose on the cell meat side of things, where people are asking about is, could the actual genetic manipulation, if it's done, say, to increase proliferation, could that change my product from the standard beef protein or whatever into something else? And obviously that's where some of the fear factors and things come in. And so that's where it's understanding how these techniques are actually used to promote the proliferation, and whether they are actually going to lead to a change in that protein. And then it becomes, again, a standard food safety perspective. Is my protein substantially similar? Do I have the right sequence analogy? In changing that protein, how have I done it? Could it lead to something else? So I think that a lot of it at the moment, there are structures out there. There are certain frameworks you may need to engage in. But if you start from the logical perspective of why am I doing this? What type of organism? What are the issues? Then what that will allow you to do, I think, is look at the relevance of some of these structures and then be able to ask the right questions to the regulators, because some of these frameworks need to evolve as the actual safety understanding and products evolve.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Okay, so one last question for the Q&A before we wrap up. Okay, so there's a question by Prabhaharan. He asks, contaminants such as a microplastic in the production of cultured meat have any passing consideration as a hazard?
I'd throw it back and say, do microplastics have, do we know what role microplastics have on the health generally? from other sources. So I think that the challenge with it's a great question when it comes to things like microplastics. What potential role do they have in health? There's still so many questions that and answers that we don't know. We know that there's a certain level of body burden. We're starting to see that. We're starting to understand that. But what impact is that having on our health? There's no real knowledge at the moment. So understanding some of these micro and nanoplastics and nanoparticles is something that definitely we need to do from a safety perspective, but level of risk and concern, I think, is an area that we need to understand more on. Contaminants in general is a key aspect. So understanding where those contaminants may arise, have they come from your food sources, have they come from ingredients, or have they arisen from the process? So with fungal fermentation as a classic example, the way that plants and fungi and organisms in those kingdoms, if they get stressed, they start producing toxins. And so understand, because they can't move, right? So they kill things around them. And so understanding if your process is going to stress that system and result in process contaminants is key. For things like cells, mammalian cells, and for cellular meat, it's unlikely because these cells have been designed to grow together as tissues and function together as tissues. So again, it's looking at the context, understanding likelihood, potential risk. And when you look at any product, whether it's a food or a consumer product or whatever, you need to look at the process, and you need to look at then how that product's going to be used and consumed, and then say, okay, understanding that process and understanding the inherent properties of the product, do I foresee any potential hazards in there, contaminants or likewise?
Okay, thank you so much, Ben. So thank you everyone for joining us. So much apologies we did not get to address your questions, but if you still want us to answer these queries, feel free to send your question to fresh@ntu.edu.sg, and we will try to answer as many of them as we possibly can.
We've screen captured them too, right, Serene?
Yes.
Yep. So we can look at trying to maybe post some general answers and things at some stage. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, great. So yeah, so if you want to connect with us, we'll be happy for a chat. And we are looking forward to seeing you again soon. So thank you to all our speakers. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, Yongquan, and Ben, and of course, all the participants here. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again for our future webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.